The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Reporters, community members, and even a few government officials filled every available seat. For weeks, the trial had gripped the nation, evolving from a local tragedy into a symbol of resistance against unchecked corporate power. Julia sat at the plaintiff's table, her shoulders squared and her eyes fixed on the jury box. The 12 jurors avoided her gaze as they filed in, their expressions unreadable. Her heart pounded in her chest as the judge called the court to order. The foreperson stood, a folded piece of paper trembling in their hand. In the case of Almeida versus Titan Corp., we, the jury, find the defendant. Time seemed to slow as the word hung in the air. Liable. Gasps rippled through the courtroom, followed by a smattering of cheers. The judge quickly banged her gavel for silence. Julia exhaled deeply, a wave of relief washing over her. They had done it. The judge continued, outlining the penalties. Titan Corp was ordered to pay substantial damages to the families of the victims and to implement sweeping changes in its operations, overseen by an independent monitor. The verdict was a landmark victory, not just for São Esperança, but for communities everywhere that had suffered under corporate negligence. Outside the courthouse, a jubilant crowd awaited. As Julia emerged, she was met with applause and cheers. Cameras flashed, and reporters shouted questions, but she ignored them, instead turning to the families of the victims. "This victory is yours," she said, her voice carrying over the crowd. "Your courage, your resilience, it made this possible. Justice has been served, but the fight doesn't end here. We must remain vigilant and ensure that no one else suffers as you have." Her words were met with thunderous applause. Among the crowd, Julia spotted Maria, Lucas, and the other community members who had stood by her. Their faces, once marked by grief, now shone with hope. The victory, however, was not without its costs. Titan Corp immediately announced plans to appeal the verdict, vowing to drag the case through higher courts. The legal battle was far from over, but Julia felt prepared. The trial had galvanized support from activists, journalists, and lawyers across the country, creating a network of allies ready to fight alongside her. In the weeks that followed, Julia's office became a hub of activity. Donations poured in to support the ongoing legal fight, and offers of help arrived from unexpected places. Even Father Miguel lent a hand, organizing volunteers to assist with community outreach. Eduardo, ever the realist, cautioned her against celebrating too soon. They'll regroup, Julia. Companies like Titan Corp never go down quietly. "I know," she replied, "but we've shown them that we're not afraid." That's the first step. As the dust settled, Julia returned to São Esperança to witness the changes her victory had sparked. The mine, now shuttered, stood as a somber reminder of the lives lost, but it also symbolized a turning point. Plans were underway to repurpose the site, creating jobs in safer, more sustainable industries. The community, once fractured by fear and grief, began to heal. Families gathered in the square for celebrations, and murals honoring the victims adorned the walls of the town. For the first time in years, there was a sense of hope. Months later, Julia stood on a makeshift stage in the heart of São Esperança, addressing a crowd that had gathered for a memorial service. The air was thick with emotion as she spoke. "We remember those we lost, not as victims, but as heroes. Their sacrifice has inspired a movement, a promise that we will never again allow greed to overshadow humanity." Her words resonated deeply, drawing tears and applause from the crowd. As she stepped down from the stage, she felt a hand on her shoulder. Turning, she saw Lucas, now a leader among the miners, his face lit with gratitude. "You've changed everything, Julia," he said. "Not just for us, but for communities everywhere." She smiled faintly. "It wasn't just me. It was all of us." In the quiet moments after the service, Julia reflected on her journey. She had faced impossible odds, endured threats and losses, and emerged stronger. The fight against Titan Corp was ongoing, but she knew she was no longer alone. Looking out at the faces of Sal Esperanza, she felt a deep sense of purpose. Her battle had become more than a quest for justice. It was a movement for change, a beacon of hope for those who had been silenced for too long. The voices that the world had tried to quiet were now roaring, unstoppable and united. As the evening sun dipped below the horizon, Julia whispered a promise to herself and to the people of Sal Esperanza. This is only the beginning. William sat in the dim glow of Sarah's small apartment, the only place he felt remotely safe after the break-in. A battered corkboard was propped against the wall, now filled with documents, names, and photos connected to the scheme. Strings of red thread crisscrossed between them, weaving a web that pointed to one man at its center, Judge Malcolm Crane. Sarah paced the room, her phone pressed to her ear. "No, I can't share the details yet," she said tersely. "Just look into the names I gave you and call me back." Ending the call, she turned to William. "That was one of my contacts in the state archives. If there's anything tying these people together on paper, he'll find it." William nodded, his eyes scanning the board. "We need more than patterns and suspicions. We need undeniable proof." The first crack in the armor came from an unlikely source. Sarah's contact unearthed a series of sealed court documents tied to a high-profile corporate fraud case from years ago. The record showed that Judge Crane had ruled in favor of a corporation with undeniable speed, barely 2 days after evidence was submitted. Digging further, William discovered that the corporation had donated millions to a nonprofit run by a close associate of Crane's mere weeks before the ruling. "It's a start," William muttered, printing the documents. "But it's not enough to topple him." Sarah leaned over his shoulder. "What about his political connections? Every judge has their kingmakers." William's mind raced. If they could link Crane's rise to political players with a stake in corporate interests, it would paint a damning picture. He added new threads to the board, connecting Crane to senators, governors, and influential donors. The next step was riskier. William needed first-hand accounts from those involved in the corruption, but approaching insiders was dangerous. Sarah reached out to a former court clerk who had resigned abruptly years earlier, a woman named Eleanor Price. They met in a secluded diner on the outskirts of the city. Eleanor was hesitant, her hands trembling as she stirred her coffee. "If they find out I'm talking to you," she began, her voice trailing off. "They won't," William assured her, "and your story could make all the difference." Eleanor glanced around nervously before speaking. "I worked in Crane's office for 5 years. At first, everything seemed normal, but then cases started disappearing, sealed files, expedited rulings. One day, I found a memo marked confidential. It detailed settlements and payments from corporations to shell companies. Crane's name was everywhere. Why didn't you go public?" Sarah asked gently. Eleanor's eyes darkened. "I tried, but the people I contacted, reporters, investigators, they either disappeared or turned me away. One night, someone left a dead rat on my doorstep with a note. 'You're next.' I left the city the next day." William leaned forward, his voice steady. "Do you still have the memo?" Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. "I couldn't bring myself to destroy it. It's locked in a safe at my house." Retrieving the memo was a high-stakes operation. Eleanor's house, in a quiet suburb, felt anything but safe as they approached. William couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The house was eerily silent as Eleanor retrieved the document, her hands shaking. "This is it," she whispered, handing over a folder. "If you're going to expose him, make it count." William scanned the memo, his breath catching at the details. It outlined a clear pipeline of bribes, listing corporations, amounts, and recipients. Crane's name was prominent, often alongside a list of court cases with expected outcomes noted in the margins. "We've got him," Sarah said, her voice tinged with triumph. "This is enough to go public." "Not yet," William said, closing the folder. "We need to connect this to the broader network. Crane's just ahead. If we bring him down, the rest will scatter." The memo gave them the leverage they needed. William and Sarah focused on the corporations listed, tracing payments through a labyrinth of shell companies. Eduardo, an old hacker contact of Williams, helped trace the money trails to offshore accounts. "You're playing a dangerous game," Eduardo warned as he handed over the files. "These people don't just threaten. They act. That's why we need to finish this quickly," William replied. As their investigation deepened, so did the threats. William began noticing cars tailing him, and Sarah received an anonymous package containing photos of her family. Inside was a note. "This is your last warning." William's determination only grew stronger. "They're scared," he told Sarah. "Which means we're close." The breakthrough came when they uncovered communications between Crane and Senator Malcolm Reed, a prominent politician with ties to several of the implicated corporations. Emails revealed discussions about judicial appointments, case outcomes, and campaign donations, all designed to protect and expand their network. William leaned back in his chair, exhaustion etched on his face. This isn't just corruption. This is a machine designed to keep power in the hands of a few, and we're going to dismantle it, Sarah said, her voice resolute. But as they prepared to go public, the stakes escalated. William's apartment was firebombed while he was away, reducing years of notes and clippings to ashes. He stared at the smoldering ruins, his fists clenched. "They're trying to scare you off," Sarah said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "But we're too close to stop now." William nodded, his gaze hardening. "If they think they can silence me, they're wrong. I've lost everything once before. I won't let them take this from me." The next chapter of their fight would require courage, strategy, and the support of a public eager for truth. As William and Sarah prepared to unleash their findings, they knew the battle ahead would be fierce, but the truth was worth every risk. The following morning, William and Sarah met in a nondescript co-working space in the city's industrial district, a temporary base of operations after the firebombing. The air inside was heavy with urgency as they organized their findings. The memo from Eleanor, the offshore account records, and the emails between Judge Crane and Senator Reed were enough to outline a compelling case. But to bring it to the public, they needed a plan. William pinned another document to the makeshift cork board. "This has to be surgical," he said. "We release everything at once. No previews, no warnings. If Crane or Reed get even a hint, they'll bury us before we can act." Sarah nodded. "We'll need to involve a major outlet. This story is too big for independent publishing. But who do we trust?" "Not many," William admitted. "But I have someone in mind." William's contact was an editor at the National Tribune, a respected outlet with a history of tackling high-stakes investigative journalism. The editor, Rachel Moore, had worked with William in his prime and had always believed in his innocence despite the scandal that ruined him. When they met in Rachel's office, she listened carefully as William and Sarah laid out the evidence. Her sharp eyes scanned the documents, her expression growing more serious with each page. "This is explosive," Rachel said finally, setting the memo down. "If this checks out, it could take down some of the most powerful people in the country. But you know what you're up against." "We do," William said. "We just need the Tribune's platform and resources to make sure this reaches the public." Rachel hesitated. "I'll run this by legal and the investigative team. If they agree, we'll move forward. But, William, if this goes live, there's no going back. You'll have a target on your back." William's gaze didn't waver. "I already do." While waiting for the Tribune's response, William and Sarah worked to strengthen their case. They tracked down another whistleblower, a former political aide who had witnessed backroom dealings between Senator Reed and corporate executives. The aide, nervous but resolute, confirmed the scheme. "It was all about control," she said, her voice shaking. "Reed and Crane worked together to ensure certain cases always went their way. In return, Reed secured funding and influence, and Crane protected the corporations. Her testimony added another layer to their mounting evidence, but it also deepened the danger. As word of their investigation spread through underground channels, the pressure against them intensified. One evening, as William returned to the co-working space, he found Sarah pacing nervously. "We've got a problem," she said, handing him her phone. On the screen was a news alert. Judge Malcolm Crane denounces fabricated allegations, calls for defamation lawsuit against unnamed parties. The article detailed a vague press conference where Crane dismissed baseless rumors and claimed to be the victim of a smear campaign. William frowned. "He's preempting us, trying to control the narrative before we even publish." Sarah nodded. "And worse, he's planting doubt. If we're not careful, this could turn into another attack on your credibility." As the Tribune's legal team reviewed the evidence, Rachel called for a final meeting. "We've verified enough to move forward," she said. "But this is risky. Once we publish, you'll need to be ready for immediate fallout." William and Sarah exchanged a glance. "We're ready," William said. Rachel gave a grim nod. "We'll set the story to go live tomorrow morning. Full spread. Be prepared for a storm." That night, William sat alone in the quiet co-working space, staring at the corkboard. The weight of what he was about to do pressed down on him. His entire career had been built on exposing the truth, but this time felt different. The stakes were higher, the risks greater. Lives, including his own, were on the line. He thought of the people who had trusted him. Eleanor, the whistleblower Sarah. He thought of the countless lives affected by Crane's corruption. Turning back was not an option. Taking a deep breath, William opened his laptop and began drafting a personal statement to accompany the story. He poured his heart into it, addressing the doubts about his past and reaffirming his commitment to the truth. "This is not just about me," he wrote. "This is about a system that has been twisted to serve the powerful at the expense of justice. Today, we reclaim the integrity of the law." The next morning, the story went live. Blindfolded Justice, the corruption network behind Judge Malcolm Crane. The article was a bombshell, complete with scanned documents, recorded testimonies, and a detailed timeline of events. News outlets across the country picked up the story within hours, and social media erupted with outrage. #JusticeForAll began trending, with citizens demanding accountability from Crane, Reed, and the corporations involved. The backlash was immediate. Crane issued a statement denying all allegations and accusing William of orchestrating a vendetta. Senator Reed followed suit, calling the article an unhinged attack on democracy, but neither could explain the damning evidence. By the afternoon, the co-working space was buzzing with activity. Rachel's team was fielding calls from media outlets, while William and Sarah monitored the fallout. But the celebration was cut short when Sarah's phone rang. "It's Eleanor," she said, her face pale. "She's been arrested." William's stomach dropped. "For what?" "Obstruction of justice," Sarah read from the text. "They're trying to discredit her testimony." William slammed his fist on the desk. "They're fighting back harder than we expected. We need to rally public support before they bury us." The chapter ended with a crucial decision. William knew the fight was far from over. The truth was out, but the system's defenders were scrambling to contain the damage. As he prepared for the next phase, William vowed to protect the people who had trusted him and ensure the story wasn't silenced. The battle for justice had reached a fever pitch, and there was no turning back. The morning after the article went live, the backlash against William and his team erupted in full force. News segments debated the validity of the accusations, with pundits taking sides. Social media was a battleground, with hashtags like #JusticeForAll and #HartleyHoax trending simultaneously. But the fiercest counterattack came not from the court of public opinion, but from the system itself. William's phone buzzed incessantly as more updates came in. Eleanor's arrest had been followed by warrants for 2 other whistleblowers. Senator Reed had mobilized his allies in the legislature to frame the article as an assault on institutional integrity, calling for immediate investigations into William, Sarah, and the National Tribune. Sarah burst into the room, a laptop clutched to her chest. "They've frozen Eleanor's accounts," she said breathlessly. "And Eduardo just called. Someone hacked into his servers. They're trying to erase the financial records." William gritted his teeth. "They're playing dirty, but this only proves they're desperate." Sarah nodded. "We need to act fast. If they destroy our evidence or discredit Eleanor's testimony, the case collapses." Meanwhile, Judge Crane made his first public appearance since the article's publication. Standing on the courthouse steps, flanked by supporters and cameras, he delivered a calculated statement. "I have dedicated my life to upholding the law," Crane said, his voice firm. "These baseless accusations are a direct attack on our judiciary's integrity. I will not allow a disgraced journalist and his accomplices to undermine decades of trust in our system." William watched the broadcast from the co-working space, his fists clenched. Crane's performance was masterful. The calculated pauses, the righteous indignation. It was a show designed to sway public sentiment. "They're painting you as a villain," Sarah said, shutting off the broadcast. "We need to flip the narrative." William's next move was bold. He arranged an exclusive live interview on a prominent independent news platform. The studio was modest compared to the sprawling networks, but it had a loyal audience known for amplifying investigative stories. As the cameras rolled, the host, a sharp-tongued journalist named Karen Wallace, dove straight into the controversy. "William Hartley," she began, "many people remember you as a celebrated journalist before your fall from grace. Now you're back with allegations that have shaken the judiciary and political establishment. Why should the public trust you?" William didn't flinch. "Because the evidence speaks for itself," he replied. "This isn't about my reputation. It's about the lives destroyed by a corrupt system. Judge Crane, Senator Reid, and their network have manipulated justice for profit. The documents, the testimonies, they're irrefutable." Karen leaned forward. "But what about the claims that you're fabricating this as a vendetta?" William met her gaze. "Let them examine the evidence. Every document is backed by records they tried to bury. Every whistleblower has faced threats to silence them. If they're innocent, why resort to intimidation?" The interview was raw and passionate, and clips went viral within hours. Public sentiment began to shift, with more voices calling for independent investigations into Crane and Reid. But the retaliation grew darker. That evening, William received a package at the co-working space. Inside was a single bullet and a note. "Drop the story or next time it's real." Sarah's face paled when she saw it. "This isn't a warning. It's a promise." William placed a bullet on the table, his expression grim. "They want me to be afraid, but I won't stop." As the threats escalated, William and Sarah knew they needed more allies. They reached out to legal advocacy groups, whistleblower protection organizations, and independent investigators. The response was overwhelming. Attorneys offered pro bono assistance for Eleanor and other whistleblowers, while cybersecurity experts helped secure their evidence. One breakthrough came when Eduardo, undeterred by the earlier hack, uncovered a cache of encrypted messages between Senator Reid and corporate executives. The messages detailed payment plans, judicial appointments, and even threats against dissenters. "This is the smoking gun," Eduardo said, sending the files to William. "If we decrypt these, we can tie them directly to Crane." Meanwhile, Eleanor's case became a rallying cry. Activists organized protests outside the courthouse where she was being held, demanding her release. The pressure forced local authorities to allow her limited access to her lawyer, who filed a motion for bail. William visited Eleanor in the detention center, her face lined with exhaustion, but her spirit unbroken. "I won't let them win," she told him, "but you need to finish this." "I will," William promised. "We're closer than ever." As the week wore on, the walls began closing in on Crane and Reid. Anonymous insiders started leaking additional documents, corroborating William's findings. A prominent civil rights organization issued a public statement calling for a federal inquiry into judicial corruption. But the fight took its toll. William's sleepless nights, constant stress, and mounting threats weighed heavily on him. One night, As he stared at the corkboard, Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've carried this alone for too long," she said gently. "Let us help. This isn't just your fight anymore." William nodded, grateful but weary. "I know, but I need to see this through." The chapter culminated in a pivotal decision. With the decrypted messages from Eduardo in hand, William prepared to take the final step. A live broadcast revealing the full extent of the corruption. It was a move that would expose Crane, Reed, and their network once and for all, but also put William in greater danger than ever. As he sat in the dim light of the co-working space, William whispered to himself, "The truth is worth it, no matter the cost." The stage was set for the ultimate confrontation, and there was no turning back. The night before the planned live broadcast, the tension was palpable. William, Sarah, Eduardo, and a handful of trusted allies gathered in the co-working space, their focus on final preparations. The decrypted messages Eduardo had uncovered were the centerpiece of their case, linking Judge Crane, Senator Reed, and a host of corporate executives in an irrefutable chain of corruption. Eduardo leaned back in his chair, exhaustion evident on his face. The encryption was tough, but it was worth it. These messages show the entire network. Payments, case manipulation, even direct orders from Crane. William examined the files, his jaw tightening. This isn't just evidence. It's a map of their operation. Once this goes live, they won't be able to deny it. Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder. "But they'll come after you harder than ever. Are you ready for that?" William looked at her, his eyes resolute. "They've already taken everything from me once. I won't let them win again." The broadcast was set for 8 p.m. the next evening, hosted by Karen Wallace on her independent news platform. It would be streamed live to millions, bypassing mainstream media to ensure the story reached the public unfiltered. As the team finalized their preparations, Eduardo raised a concern. "Our encryption is solid, but they might try to take down the stream. We need a backup." Sarah nodded. "I'll handle it. We'll record everything locally and distribute it through secure channels if needed." William glanced at the clock. "This is it. Let's make sure every detail is airtight." The hours leading up to the broadcast were filled with unease. Sarah's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "If you value your life, cancel the broadcast." She showed it to William, her face pale. "They know what we're planning. They can threaten us all they want," William said, his voice steady. "The truth is going out." At 7:30 p.m., the team arrived at the studio. Karen greeted them, her expression a mix of determination and concern. "We've got everything ready. Once we go live, there's no stopping it." William nodded. "Good. Let's do this." The studio was small but professional, with cameras and lighting set up to ensure a polished broadcast. As William took his place on the set, he felt a rush of adrenaline. This was his moment to reclaim his integrity and expose the truth. The broadcast began with Karen introducing the story. "Good evening. Tonight, we bring you a story that could shake the very foundations of our judicial and political systems." Joining us is William Hartley, the journalist who uncovered the network of corruption involving Judge Malcolm Crane, Senator Malcolm Reed, and several major corporations. The camera panned to William, who began detailing the investigation. He walked the audience through the evidence, starting with the memo from Eleanor and leading up to the decrypted messages. "These messages," William said, holding up printed copies, show direct coordination between Judge Crane and Senator Reed. They outline payments, case outcomes, and threats against whistleblowers. This is not speculation. This is a documented conspiracy. Karen displayed some of the messages on screen, reading excerpts aloud. The evidence was damning, and the live chat exploded with reactions from viewers. As the broadcast continued, Eduardo monitored the stream from a secure location. "We've got over 1 million viewers and climbing," he reported, "but there's unusual traffic hitting the server." Minutes later, the stream faltered, the screen freezing momentarily. Eduardo cursed under his breath. "They're trying to shut us down." Sarah's voice crackled over the comms. Switching to the backup server now, the stream resumed and Karen addressed the audience. It seems there are attempts to disrupt this broadcast, but we won't be silenced. Let's continue. The climax came when William unveiled the financial records and the encrypted messages. He pointed to a particular email from Crane to Reed. Ensure the Hartley situation is handled. We can't afford more exposure. This, William said, his voice steady, is proof that Crane and Reed were directly involved in the scandal that destroyed my career. They fabricated evidence to discredit me, all to protect their operation. The studio fell silent as Karen turned to William. What do you hope to achieve with this broadcast? William looked directly into the camera. I hope to expose the truth, to show that no one is above the law, and to inspire others to stand up, no matter the cost. The broadcast ended at 9 p.m., but the fallout began immediately. Social media exploded with outrage, and mainstream news outlets scrambled to cover the story. Hashtags like #CraneExposed and #ReedResigned trended worldwide. But the retaliation was swift. Within an hour, William received a call from Rachel. I just got word that a warrant's been issued for your arrest. They're accusing you of hacking and illegal possession of documents. William's stomach tightened. They're trying to silence me again. We'll fight this, Rachel said. Stay safe. The team regrouped at a safe house, the weight of the night pressing down on them. Sarah spoke first. We did it. The truth is out. But they're coming for us, Eduardo added. We need to be ready. William sat in silence, his mind racing. He had taken the leap, exposing everything, but the fight was far from over. The corruption he had revealed was vast, and its defenders would stop at nothing to protect themselves. As dawn broke, William stood outside, the first rays of sunlight casting long shadows on the ground. He knew the battle ahead would be fierce, but for the first time in years he felt hope. The world now knew the truth, and that truth was a powerful weapon. This is just the beginning, he whispered to himself, preparing for the storm to come. The morning after the broadcast, the fallout was both immediate and staggering. News outlets across the political spectrum replayed clips from Williams' live interview, while analysts debated the implications of his findings. Protests erupted outside courthouses and government buildings, with citizens demanding resignations, investigations, and reform. But for William and his team, there was no time to celebrate. The battle was far from over. At the safe house, the mood was tense. Eduardo was glued to his laptop, monitoring social media and news coverage. The good news is, public sentiment is overwhelmingly on our side, he reported. The bad news? Crane's team is hitting back hard. They're calling you a criminal, William, and they're pushing to bury Eleanor's case entirely. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, her head in her hands. It's not just Crane. Reed's office just released a statement calling for immediate legal action against you. They're accusing you of cybercrimes, hacking, and leaking classified information. William paced the room, his frustration mounting. They're trying to turn this into a story about me, not the corruption. We can't let them shift the focus. Meanwhile, Eleanor remained in custody. Her lawyer had filed a motion for bail, but the court had delayed the hearing. Rachel called with an update. The judge presiding over Eleanor's case has a known history of favorable rulings for Reed's allies. They're using her as leverage to force you to back down. William's voice hardened. We're not backing down. We're doubling down. The team decided to escalate. They reached out to civil rights organizations, whistleblower protection groups, and independent legal experts to amplify their fight. A coalition began to form, with prominent lawyers offering to represent Eleanor and investigative watchdogs pledging to dig deeper into the corruption. Sarah organized a press conference, rallying support from activists and journalists. Standing at a podium surrounded by supporters, she addressed the gathered crowd. This isn't just about one journalist or one whistleblower, Sarah declared. This is about exposing a system that has prioritized power and profit over justice. We will not be silenced. The retaliation, however, became increasingly personal. Anonymous threats poured in, and strange cars were spotted near the safe house. Late one night, William received a chilling text. "You've made a mistake. We're watching." Eduardo tightened the team's security, encrypting their communications and setting up surveillance around the safe house. "We need to be careful," he warned. "They're getting desperate." William's resolve only deepened. "Let them watch. They'll see we're not afraid." As public pressure mounted, cracks began to show in the network. A junior staffer in Senator Reid's office leaked internal memos, revealing the senator's direct involvement in coordinating payments to Judge Crane. The memos, obtained by a sympathetic reporter, provided a devastating new layer of evidence. "This is it," Rachel told William during a late-night call. "This takes it from circumstantial to concrete. Reid and Crane are finished." But the revelations also intensified the stakes. Senator Reid gave a fiery speech on the Senate floor, denouncing William as a rogue journalist spreading dangerous lies. Crane filed a motion to suppress all evidence against him, claiming it was obtained illegally. The tipping point came when Eleanor was finally granted bail. Her release was met with a massive public rally, with protesters cheering as she walked out of the courthouse. Eleanor, though visibly shaken, spoke briefly to the crowd. "They tried to silence me, but I'm still standing," she said, her voice steady. "And I will testify to the truth." Her courage inspired others to come forward. Within days, additional whistleblowers emerged, corroborating the corruption network's existence. The tide was turning, but the fight was far from won. One evening, as the team reviewed the new evidence, Eduardo received an urgent alert. "They've issued an arrest warrant for you, William," he said, his voice grim. "They're claiming you hacked into Reid's office to steal the memos." William nodded, unsurprised. "They're trying to discredit me, but the truth is out now. They can't stop it." Sarah stood, her face resolute. "We need to make our next move. What's the plan?" William looked at the team, his voice steady. "We push harder. We force their hand. If they want to come after me, I'll give them a reason to." The next day, William held a press conference on the courthouse steps, flanked by Eleanor and a growing coalition of supporters. Cameras flashed as he addressed the gathered media. "I stand here today not as a victim, but as a fighter for the truth," he said. "The evidence we presented is undeniable. Judge Crane, Senator Reid, and their allies have abused their power for years, and they must be held accountable. I will not back down, no matter what threats they throw at me." The statement was bold, and it sent shockwaves through the political and judicial establishment. But it also painted a target squarely on William's back. That night, the safe house was attacked. A Molotov cocktail shattered a front window, igniting the living room. The team scrambled to extinguish the flames, their hearts pounding with adrenaline. No one was hurt, but the message was clear. The corruption network was escalating its tactics. As firefighters arrived, William stood outside, the flickering flames casting long shadows across his face. He turned to Sarah and Eduardo, his voice steady despite the chaos. "They think they can scare us into silence," he said, "but they've underestimated us. We've come too far to stop now." The chapter ended with the team preparing for their final move. The coalition had grown, the evidence was mounting, and public support was at an all-time high. But the stakes had never been higher, and William knew the ultimate showdown was looming. The fight for survival had reached its breaking point, and the truth was closer than ever to prevailing. The day of the final confrontation arrived, and William knew the stakes could not be higher. After months of investigation, countless threats, and near-constant danger, the fight for justice had reached its breaking point. The evidence was airtight, the coalition stronger than ever, and public opinion overwhelmingly in their favor. But the opposition was powerful, and they would stop at nothing to protect themselves. The plan was bold. William and his team would host a live tribunal, a virtual event broadcast to millions, presenting the full scope of the corruption. The coalition of lawyers, whistleblowers, and investigative journalists would take turns unveiling the evidence, leaving no room for doubt. It was an unprecedented move, bypassing the corrupted courts entirely and putting the truth directly into the hands of the public. As the team gathered in the new secure location, the tension was palpable. Eduardo finished setting up the encrypted streaming platform. Sarah reviewed the presentation order, and Eleanor rehearsed her testimony one last time. William stood before them, his voice calm but resolute. "This is it," he said. "This is where we show the world what they've tried so hard to hide. No matter what happens tonight, we've already won by refusing to stay silent." At 7 p.m., the broadcast began. Sarah introduced the event, her tone firm but empathetic. "Good evening," she began. "Tonight, we bring you the culmination of months of investigation into one of the most insidious corruption networks in modern history. This is not just a story about individuals. It's a story about the systems that enable them and the people fighting to hold them accountable." The camera shifted to William, standing beside a large digital screen displaying the web of connections. He outlined the investigation step by step, starting with the memo from Eleanor and leading to the decrypted messages, financial records, and testimonies. "This is more than circumstantial evidence," William said. "This is a documented conspiracy involving Judge Malcolm Crane, Senator Malcolm Reed, and their corporate allies. They have manipulated the law for profit, destroyed lives, and undermined the foundations of justice." Eleanor took the stage next, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "I worked in Judge Crane's office for 5 years," she began. "I saw firsthand how cases were manipulated, evidence buried, and lives discarded in favor of corporate profits. When I tried to speak out, I was silenced. But tonight, I refuse to be silent any longer." Her testimony was raw and emotional, drawing tears and outrage from viewers. Social media lit up with messages of support, and the hashtag #JusticeUnveiled began trending globally. The climax of the event came when Eduardo unveiled the decrypted messages, projected onto the screen for all to see. Each email and transaction painted a damning picture. Bribes routed through shell companies, threats against whistleblowers, and direct communications between Crane, Reed, and their corporate benefactors. One email in particular silenced the virtual audience. It was a message from Reed to Crane. "Ensure Hartley is neutralized. We can't afford another scandal." William's voice cut through the tension. "This message isn't just about me. It's about every person they've silenced, every truth they've buried. But tonight, we're taking back the narrative." As the broadcast continued, the impact was immediate. Public outrage reached a boiling point, with protests erupting in cities across the country. Mainstream news outlets, forced to cover the revelations, replayed clips from the tribunal, while analysts struggled to defend Crane and Reed. But the fight wasn't over. Midway through the broadcast, Eduardo's system detected a massive cyber attack aimed at shutting down the stream. He worked frantically to block the intrusion, sweat pouring down his face. "They're trying to take us offline," Eduardo muttered. "But they won't succeed." The stream flickered but held steady, a testament to the team's resilience. As the final segment aired, Sarah addressed the audience. "Tonight, we've shown you the truth. Now it's up to all of us to demand accountability. Corruption thrives in silence, but together, we can ensure justice is served." The aftermath was a whirlwind. Within hours, federal investigators announced they were opening inquiries into Crane, Reed, and the corporations involved. Whistleblower protections were extended to Eleanor and others, and prominent legal organizations offered to take on the cases pro bono. Crane resigned from the bench under immense public pressure, his reputation in ruins. Reed faced calls for impeachment, with bipartisan support for his removal. The corporations implicated in the scheme scrambled to contain the damage, but lawsuits flooded in from affected communities. For William, the victory was bittersweet. He had reclaimed his integrity and exposed a system of corruption, but the cost had been steep. As he stood in the quiet of their now empty workspace, he reflected on the journey. Sarah approached, her expression a mix of exhaustion and pride. "You did it, William. You brought them down." "No," he replied, a faint smile on his face. "We did it. Together." Months later, William was invited to speak at a national journalism conference. Standing before an audience of aspiring reporters, he delivered a message that resonated deeply. "The fight for truth is never easy," he said. "It requires courage, resilience, and sacrifice. But in the end, truth is the most powerful weapon we have. Never let anyone take that away from you." The room erupted into applause, a reminder that William's journey had inspired a new generation to carry the torch forward.